Sometimes when we have these conversations, I learn a lot about my own thinking, biases, challenges. This is one of those conversations with Andrew Greer that challenge so much of the way I respond to other people.
Well, we're going to find out why in just a moment. Andrew is a singer, songwriter. He's a recording artist. He's an author. He's a filmmaker. And he made this incredible move of going from Nashville, where there's all sorts of activity, to
Right.
this tiny little town in Georgia. And it's a fascinating story as we get to know him. So stay with us here on Don and Steve Plus.
We're going to talk about a former president of the United States, but you're going to have to stay with us to get to that subject matter, because we're going to start with Andrew Greer and how you even got to be interested in President Jimmy Carter. When I first met you, you lived in Middle Tennessee. You were singing bluegrass music. This is my first introduction to Andrew Greer. I was at a concert. You were doing a benefit for a ministry that I love. And I'm like, who is that dude? I don't know who that is. Cindy Morgan was with you.
Get him out of here.
No, it was great. It was great. But I just didn't. And then the Lord would give us opportunity to get to know one another. And now I call you friend. It's an honor to have you in the studio. How did you get from bluegrass music? Well, let's start there. Why music?
Well, music has always been home base. You know, from the time I was a child. My dad was a therapist. He's retired now. And then my mother, an organist. And then later in her career became a music educator as well. And so she ended up teaching. I have two older brothers. We grew up in Texas, a small town west of Fort Worth, kind of, I call it the fringes of West Texas, where all of it opens up. You know, the sky's big. And my mother taught each of us piano when we were old enough to read, kind of so we could be independent learners, right? And it did not work at all with my two older brothers. No, they have their own brand of musicianship, but I loved it. I fell in love with the piano. I fell in love with music. It just felt like I was able to, in a way, speak, you know, for the first time. And so I just kind of ran with it. She didn't even have to keep teaching me. I just kept going and loved it. So when I got to Nashville through college, which was Belmont University, I went for music. I didn't quite know how that would fit into the scope of Nashville music scene, but I knew that I loved music and I loved songwriting and I loved performance, kind of all of it. Just I didn't know where to go with it. And really, as I've gotten older, I realized that for at least my personality, one segment of some interest is not going to keep my interest for my entire life. It's going to be a road to something else. And so the music still was the beginning of my journey into creative fields. And I think it always is where I come back to when I'm feeling, one, a need to connect with myself. And then I think that's closely related for me in connecting with God. So in a lot of ways, music was my first conversation with God too. I mean, how do you pray? What do you say? You know, the exercise of prayer can express itself in so many different ways. And for me, pressing my fingers into those keys kind of gave me a sense of identity with God. And still, again, that's why it's home base too, is I come back to it in the seasons of my life, especially when I'm, you know, at a loss, I guess, of what to say or how to even, you know, maneuver my own path.
Yeah.
Then I come back to music to find that conversation again with God.
Well, you have branched into a variety of different areas, from writing to producing film documentaries and all sorts of things. But I love this coming back to music and as a way to, in a sense, express who you are to God, remind yourself of who He is. And what is it you think that God, in a sense, or how He's wired you so that when you are at the keyboard, when you are writing and singing and doing all that, how do you, in a sense the presence of God in that?
Gosh, Steve, that's a good question. You know, it wouldn't be isolated to just music, though I will answer your question. I think, you know, this idea that we're living and being in, because of Christ, in the Spirit of God, right, is living in and through us. It's a living thing, right? Not just God existed,
Right.
and now we find our path to connect with how he existed, but he is existing, and we get to be a part of that existence, part of that story. So I I don't know how I experience God. That's a big
Big
It's a big, yeah,
question.
it is.
I guess I could detail maybe how some of that expresses itself in my life in music,
Yeah.
and that's what you're saying. But the same, I'm a lover of nature. I was a big backpacker when I was younger. Now I prefer to go on long hikes and go back to a hotel. It's changing, but it would be this. I remember walking with my mom one time when I still lived here in Middle Tennessee, and of course we know how the fall is here. It's just gorgeous, at least compared to where I grew up in Texas, and now in South Georgia, it's a little different. But I remember my mom wanted to go for a walk, so we went to this college that was near the house where I was living at the time, and it was kind of later fall, and the leaves were doing their thing, with the wind and the breeze, and they were drying out. They were starting to fall, and I remember my mom. This is gonna sound really hippie, and she's not really a hippie. But I find out more things about her the older I get. I take pictures of her doing things and send them to my brothers and go, this is where we are. But she went up to this gorgeous tree that was making this beautiful music, and just I think she did it partially for my benefit, but she gave it a big hug and she said, "You've done good." And my mother's a very grounded woman in her faith with God.
Yeah.
But
I've met her.
I think to some degree she was expressing her own gratitude to the presence of God everywhere. And I think about even how that memory will connect me with my mother one day when she's gone and I'm still here, and I think of the presence of God and the activity of our relationships with one another. And then again, going back to music, I really think music is a spiritual language in and all by itself, and I'm not sure why that was given to us to be such a kind of potent connection with God, but it does seem like there's a lot of God speaking within, the arc of a melody and the prose of a beautiful verse. I mean, so we know how universal of a language it is,
Yeah.
right? Even when we find ourselves all segmented up and kind of at each other's throats, music just distills it and dispels it so quickly. So that has to be God, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, it soothes the savage beasts, as we would say. And when the psalmist, there's so much music in Scripture. The psalmist and the flute and the lyre. And when you're talking about how you love to connect with the keys or the guitar or whatever, I was thinking of that Olympian, Eric, was it Liddell or Little? I've heard, and Twyla Paris did a song, He Is No Fool, years ago that talked about him and Nate Saint and those guys. But you think about how the Lord just, when he wires you a certain way and you're cooperating in the way he's wired you, it is worship. You're giving all that talent, all that he's given you back to him. And so when you're connecting with the keys or the lyric, it's what the Lord has put in there. It just kind of returns worship.
Yeah,
back
I
to the
definitely
one.
think, like, when I think about acoustic music, which is what I come from, and I think about acoustic instruments, it's as if, they're just picking up on the frequencies. I'm just plugging into a frequency that's already out there. And so it's as if the earth was already set to a song, we just get to tap into it. And of course, we know the creator that has set that song into motion. So that, to me, again, is a direct connection, to his expression throughout the world and the universe.
And so you come here pursuing music, go to Belmont, and then are going to go into the Christian music scene?
Yeah, it was Americana, folk, Christian. I mean, it just kind of was all over the map. But yes, the Nashville music scene for sure, which is largely Christian and country, right?
Right, exactly. And so as you began to pursue that and go down that road, what surprised you?
What did it?
How little it paid. I came up, in the era that was just after the digital revolution, so we were all sinking into a different norm. I guess probably, though, the business side of it was unique, and
That's a good way to
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think
Unique.
everything has to have its way to be structured. And it has, we can't, things don't just get thrown up against the wall and put bread on the, table for your family. But yeah, maybe, I mean, well, I don't know if it surprised me then, but it is interesting. This is very fresh for me in feeling some disassociation with what I had really, the basket I put my eggs into for,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is just a part of being open to life, and living. We don't stay in one spot. Now, some people, the basket they first put their eggs into is their design for the majority of their life. And I don't think there's any shame in that. That's interesting in its own way. For me and my life, it's just been that there were several baskets lined up, and so I think that is surprising to me that I don't connect with it in the same way I used to. And what do I do with that? You look at it and go, well, did I spend my energy somewhere I wasn't supposed to? Did I just land where I was meant to be? And I was talking actually to Cindy, who's one of my dearest friends and has also had quite an evolution in her career with different mediums of artistic expression. And she said something to the effect of, no, we didn't waste our time. We made decisions based on where we were and what was piquing our interest and where the opportunity was. But she was like, if we hadn't ever done this thing or that thing, we wouldn't be accessible to people in the same way we are because of that experience. And I guess really, if you think about whatever field we put our plow to, the end goal is not just the practical, like what are we going to produce from it that will benefit us or others. It really is kind of like who will we meet along the way,
The journey.
Yeah, and how will they relate to us and us relate to them, and that brings kind of everything together. But yeah, so
We get that, Andrew, at
yeah.
our
Oh,
yeah.
age, though. We get that.
I know you
and,
do. I know you do.
But in our 20s, when Andrew Greer is coming out of college and you're in your 20s and 30s, like, you don't necessarily get that then. You don't understand the impact of relationship.
We didn't, did we?
Nope.
No. I mean, it's important to have friends. Whether or not your family is connected, you're thankful or
Sure.
you're sad, lamenting that you don't have whatever your backstory is. But to understand the impact and importance of relationship now as opposed to then.
Well, I mean, it's the entree into this entire season I found myself in, and into the move to Plains, Georgia, which is a town of 500 people in the middle of farmland. That's a big difference between Nashville when I first came 20-something years ago and now, for sure. So, and that really, I didn't know. People will always say, how did you get to Plains from Nashville?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll start that over.
Yeah.
Bless you.
Thank you.
Or we'll keep it real, whatever. But
We'll keep it real.
We'll keep it real.
Yep.
Okay. But, how did I decide as a single person who has a fairly metropolitan profession to settle into this very rural town? And I do think it was kind of a hearkening to the community I grew up with and in. I remember my parents saying they chose, because they had fairly metropolitan professions, and yet we grew up in a small community where they could exercise and practice that. But I remember something to the effect of them saying, well, we really wanted to live around real people. Not that there's not real people in big cities, but people who are in their day-to-day existence, it's kind of closer to the earth is how I perceived it. And so I feel like I'm getting back to that to some degree, and that sense of connectedness, which is entirely relational and community, which is on some levels terrifying, and I
Yeah.
live in a little downtown area and my front porch is right there where we all are. That's different than living in the neighborhood I lived in and a quieter spot. And so it can be vulnerable,
Sure.
but trying to step out on a limb with the courage to realize the reward for that for me is a much more fulfilling existence.
As I was reading some of the things about you, I saw you had said something recently that you have been in this season a sense of instead of pursuing projects, you're pursuing people, pursuing and I love that idea and that concept. Never thought of framing it in that way. And so as you have done this and you've gone and put yourself in a position where you potentially have to be a lot more vulnerable,
Yeah.
or you're going to be absolutely isolated in a town of only
it'll be
that many, 500 people. What has God shown you about yourself in doing that?
Well, I'm pretty selfish. And so while I crave relationship and all the infrastructure of that is good and whole, I also crave a great deal of autonomy. Some of that is okay. Some of that's necessary for the craft and also just for my introverted sanity, for how I'm built. But challenging that, at kind of every little turn. I try to be available, in a small town, it's all of us required. And then in a small town that hosted, a former president and his wife for their lifetime, that requires an even extra layer of connectedness with the town and infrastructure and support. So trying to respond, like not have my phone hooked on my hip, but to when I'm paged, appropriately, to respond and go, sure, I'll come help you with that. To be interrupted, I guess. That's where my selfishness comes in. Like, no, I kind of had today mapped out, and this is how it's going to go. And it was largely alone.
You're stepping on my toes, man.
Yeah, like here's our group time. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like here's when we're going to get together. That's planned, and it's dicey for me inside. Now there are, having boundaries around personal time is not a bad thing, but being able to step out of myself to go, no, that's good to go be a part of that or to help with that or to be available for that is new. And even finding, like, I've always thought I was service oriented, and we have this food drive that serves, 300 to 400 families every month. And Rosalind Carter actually started years and years and years ago, 30 years ago, with two of the women at our church at Maranatha. And it's kind of expanded and grown and now serves the county and even beyond that. It's really wonderful and really wonderfully executed. But I find myself, it's an early Saturday morning, kind of thing. And I can walk across, I can walk like 50 yards to where it is. So all I have to do is get up, and I'm just like, I don't want to do that this morning. It's just so strange that it's such an effort in me. So I don't know what that's going to produce by challenging that, but I'm trying to just be present and like, well, it may not be enjoyable.
Well, you're being
but I'm going to
present,
do it.
but you're being honest. And I think a lot of us get to a point where we're not honest about that very thing. Like we may grumble and say, I don't want to get up and do it, but it's more than that. You're going to a deeper place in the heart, a deeper place in the mind than just, that's inconvenient for me today because I want to be by myself, or it's inconvenient for me.
Sure. I'm trying to be aware.
That's it. And I think a lot of times, and I hope this isn't too broad of a brush, but within the church, we don't get super honest with why we're not like we say that's important that we serve in that area, and then if somebody said, well, when's the last time you served at a food bank, I think it gets pretty quiet pretty quick.
I think some of that has to do with, from my perspective, that we in the church are not each other's neighbors. Now, there may be various reasons for that. It may not be because we're not neighborly, but we go to large congregations now, a lot of us, and we drive a good distance to get there. And sometimes that's for our kids. Sometimes that's maybe we're employed by that church. Whatever reason there is, that's one of the things Plains is reintroducing me to is the local church. And so we really do live near one another. And those of us who choose to worship together are coming from a half-mile to mile radius, So.
And what is the big difference? I mean, yeah, I can get to church in 5 minutes instead of 20 minutes is a surface level difference. But under the surface, what does that do to you as an individual, and you think does that do to the church body?
Yeah, well, having that interaction, that interface with the people I worship with on a day-to-day basis, I think produces a knowing that is not possible just within slipping into the pew next to one another. And, I heard someone say one time, they said, we just don't know what heaviness or circumstance that person slips into the pew next to us in. But when you're neighbors with them, you're more likely to know that.
Yeah.
And that produces also a different resonance in our worship together, because it doesn't mean we have to talk about it at church. It may be a private matter. It may not be something for public consumption. But it also challenges my biases and my prejudices. So when I learn more about my neighbor and they learn more about me in actuality, then to worship next to one another sure does bring about a different, and I would say a broader picture of God than maybe I had been thinking when I think of God just as my personal Savior, but indeed the Redeemer of every person in the world. That just paints for me a different light. It really then at that point becomes rubber meets the road with my, again, biases and prejudices. Just much easier again, right, to be biased against something I don't struggle with than it is what I struggle with. So that's what I think introduces us to a deepening picture of God.
Yeah. Man, we could keep going for like the next hour on that right there. But as we're talking with Andrew Greer, we're going to pause the conversation, and we're going to have a part two of the conversation with Andrew. And there was so much more to his story and how he ended up in this little town in South Georgia, in Plains, Georgia. So I think it's going to be a fascinating part of the conversation. So make sure that you like and subscribe to the podcast so you do not miss that. He's written a lot about that in a book that we're going to be talking about coming up in just a moment, More Than a President, Sundays with Jimmy Carter. And I'm looking forward to getting into that and hope that you will join us for that. So again, like and subscribe, any podcast platform. Thanks to Raphael's Roastery for their support. Details about Andrew, about this book, in the show notes. So check that out. And thanks for watching today.